Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's get going on our next panel discussion. I'm really excited about this one. We've been trying to bring this group of people together for quite a while now, so I'm really looking forward to it. So we kind of had a precursor to this earlier, talking about in Mark's first panel in terms of talking about documentation, and what we want to do today is kind of drill into that into more detail. So obviously, as all too familiar with the challenges that were associated with the VM Big Bang in March 2017, there were two common complaints that came out from that. One was that it took too long to negotiate an agreement, and the second one was, once it was completed, how long it took for those executed agreements to be set up, to be operationally ready, and so that you can margin, trade, and operate. So, given these experiences, you now sort of see a number of different services and platforms appearing to try to help solve those problems. So today we have two representation from two law firms that are working on solutions to tackle the problem of how long it takes to negotiate and put an agreement in place, and to provide an electronic record of that agreement that can then be consumed into downstream systems. We also have with us two digitization providers who have solutions that help support capturing agreement terms from legacy documents and new agreements that are negotiated or continue to be negotiated offline. And then obviously from an Acadiasoft perspective, we are partnering with each of those providers and looking at the ability to consolidate legal agreement data, create a standardized data representation of those agreements, automate the creation of an operational margin agreement from those legal agreements, and make this data available through a standard API for consumption into the internal systems. So this process creates a centralized and consolidated golden source of legal and operational data terms. And finally, we also will hear from two firms on their experiences in looking at agreement management and getting their perspectives on this. So on our panel today, we have Doug Donahue from Linklaters and representing Is2Create negotiation platform. We have David Lucking from Allen Novery and representing the Margin Exchange negotiation platform. We have Mike Lyons from PwC, who's representing from the perspective of digitization. We have Nitika Goel from JP Morgan from a user perspective. Joe Spiro from Societe Generale, also from a user perspective. And then Mike Barrett from Genpact, who is also coming from the digitization perspective as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Okay, that's, I kind of wanted to, I said to the group I'd try to keep it as very quick as possible because I want to get into the questions. I want to kind of get the conversation going here. So let's go into the first question, and I'll address this to Joe first, and then if Nitika can talk after that. But can you give us your perspective on all of the activity you're seeing in sort of the negotiation space and around agreement management in general, and what do you see as the principles that are important to you and your firm when considering this?
Sure, Richard. It's interesting to hear you talk about how there was a lot of complaints about the time it took to negotiate and execute the agreements in the first three phases. You compare the volumes that we experienced in the first three phases of the regulations to the volumes we're expected to see in phase 4 and particularly in phase 5, and this problem has potential to grow exponentially larger. So capturing the data from the document once executed and actually negotiating that document rather, is critically important to the operations of the margin process as well as actually pricing the book of the underlying derivative transactions. It's important that it be captured quickly so that margining can start. It's important that it be captured accurately. So I think we're going to hear a couple of different models from the panelists here. One of the models that I like to refer to as getting the document from the data. The other one is getting the data from the document, right? So in one model, you can have a negotiation platform where you negotiate digitally, and you start with that data and create the document from it. Then you can have one where the document has already been negotiated, and then you can extract the data from that document that already exists. And I guess we'll talk about the pros and the cons of both. From my perspective, the key thing, regardless of which model you go with or a combination of the two, which actually I think is probably the best alternative, is that the data be captured quickly and accurately and efficiently so that we can facilitate efficient collateral operations, and that it be accurate so that we don't have collateral mismatches or potentially trading mismatches based on that data.
Joe's covered it, actually. I think the only other piece that I would say is, even if you don't do either of those, right, the biggest challenge that we had for 2017, the big bang for VM, was understanding our data sets and understanding what is the documentation set that we are even talking about that we then have to renegotiate. And I think a lot of people will remember these calls with everybody trying to say, we've got this huge list of pending agreements which nobody seems to know who it belongs to. Where are these agreements? Where are these agreements stored? Who has these agreements? Shall I send you a copy of my CSA? And then getting a copy of the CSA and trying to understand who it belongs to, who's servicing it, where is it set up, and then doing the setups that you have to do downstream from it became a challenge. And so the more accurate data that you have at the source, the more accurate it is downstream, the less challenges you have where you have to spend, a lot of resources doing cleanup and reconciliation exercises. I think so that's where, the negotiations place, the developments in the negotiation space, the developments in the digitization space become important. I think digitization, standardization, and interoperability will become like the keywords that we absolutely need to happen.
Yeah. So Joe, did you have something else? Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think you brought some really good points there, and I think that we're seeing that a lot in terms of there's really good work that's going on to look at new agreements and getting those in place, but there's also what about your existing agreements, and do you have a good digital record of what exists now as well? So I think we'll come to that when we look at the digitization side, but maybe to start with, we'll kind of look at the negotiation and space. So David, if you could sort of give us some perspectives on what you're doing with margin exchange and how you see that addressing the problem of not making the problem worse, and how do we kind of look forward and move forward?
Yeah, so I was really glad to hear Disney's A Whole New World as we were taking the stage, because I really feel like this is kind of a new world for the way that we negotiate documents. I think our experience, even predating VM, but going into sort of the financial crisis and defaults of counterparties, and trying to understand what triggers you have in your derivatives documentation, and literally having to either hopefully find a PDF version of the document, or else, sort of trawling through a dog-eared, coffee-stained copy of a master agreement to figure out what it says. I mean, that was just a huge learning experience for us to say, this cannot be the way that we go forwards. And obviously then with these large repapering exercises, that has thrown this issue into relief. Now, I think you are absolutely right. Right now, the key thing is about making sure that we're not making the problem any worse. And so we think it's really important to start treating these documents as data. And that's really what they are. They are data points, and in particular, something like a CSA is so, with the help of the standardization that ISDA has brought to the CSA, and the other types of trading documentation and the industry associations that support those documents. These documents really are just data points. And so the way that we approached VM negotiations and also would approach IM negotiations from the margin exchange perspective is to say, okay, well, what are the key commercial terms? What are the key data points that you are concerned about? Let's all focus on this as essentially a term sheet. And that then also helps, I think, focus people's attention in the negotiation. So going to your point around speed of negotiation, let's not get bogged down by where the extra comma goes or whether we're going to put reasonably before or after the verb. Let's focus on where the money is. These margin documents are really, there is value that is at stake here. And so let's make sure that, first of all, we are good to trade when the regs go live. And let's make sure that we're really focusing people's attention on what matters and not worry about sort of moving around wordsmithing documents. And when you're a dealer that is facing negotiations with 1,000 counterparties in phase 5, and that's not 1,000 documents, that's 1,000 counterparties. Then you have to think, okay, well, there's one leg where I'm posting, there's potentially a different document where my counterparty's posting to me. They both have potentially different custodians. So you have this multiplicity of documents. You really have to drill it down to the data points. And that's what margin exchange tries to do with negotiating essentially a term sheet and the ability to press a button and then convert that into a document that you and I and everyone else can read and is familiar with. It also has a real benefit, though, because as we've experienced from some of the earlier phases, people's sort of decisions around the collateral that they might post may evolve over time. And so you also want the flexibility and the ease to go back in and say, okay, well, actually, I made a determination around these government bonds where previously I was not willing to accept them. Now I want to check all of my CSAs to find where I don't have them and see if I can now post them. Or vice versa, the regulators come out and say, actually, you determined that this particular type of bond was eligible. Well, we're now giving you clarification that actually this government agency is not one of the ones that we were including within this sort of more ambiguous provision in the regulation. So you can go in, find that data point, and again, at a click of a button, amend all of your documents across all of your counterparties through, focusing in really on the data points.
Thank you. Doug, from your perspective, is to create, can you provide some insights? And I guess in particular, kind of interested in, where you see is to create helping not just, I guess, in terms of how fast it takes to create an agreement, but things you may be doing to also expedite that process of getting it into something that's operationally ready, and how important that part is as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, is to create is actually much more than margin, and is intended to be much more than margin. Quite frankly, we're using margin as an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to get into this new world. We're changing the way people do things, and to change the way people do things, we really need a reason. And that reason is the compliance dates that are upcoming for regulatory initial margin. But if you think about this as I do from a long-term perspective, right, we will do the Reg IM documentation, both CSAs and ISDA documentation plus the custodial documentation. Then we'll move on to other trading documentation. Then, quite frankly, we'll move on to other documentation. And the idea will be we will have taken the industry, hopefully, if we're successful, to a new way of negotiating documents. And that new way of negotiating documents will be really powerful, not for us lawyers in the room, but for all of the people who operationalize that data downstream, right? Because we've heard already on this panel and others, the challenges we all have to have what I would call clean data, right? And that's just accurate data. If you have the person who is making the decisions and who is negotiating the document, typing in or clicking in or punching in the data into the system and then having no other human intervention with respect to that data, but it's going directly downstream, you're removing a lot of the situations where the errors occur. Okay? So as far as is the create goes, much more broadly, we are looking to do a lot more. Margin is kind of the way to open the door, but there's more than that, right? And I think the industry needs more than that. What I would also say is we've really focused on a few what I would call guiding principles for is to create, and there's probably a very long list, but no one wants to hear the long list, so I'll give you the abridged list. There's usability, right? So the way that when you use is to create, it is not very different than what people do today. And what I mean by that is there is a split screen if you want a split screen, it's very flexible, and you see while you're clicking on the buttons that to say applicable or not applicable, or cash is my base currency or termination currency, or wherever the case may be, you're actually seeing the document being filled out on the other side of the screen. So there's no question of, okay, well, I'm putting this data into this box. What am I getting out? How do I see that? Because you're seeing it immediately. It's real time, right? The other thing is we are, again, kind of doing what people are used to. Rather than typing in the USD, you're just clicking, and you get a drop-down that says USD, and you're clicking on that. So it's actually 2 less clicks, but you're still seeing the same thing. The other two I always like to say together, the other 2 guiding principles I'll mention, because I always get a couple strange looks from the audience. It's flexibility and standardization. Like, how can those 2 guiding principles go together, right? They seem to be opposites. On the flexibility side, we are not, right, we're going to restrict what people can agree whatsoever. You can agree whatever you like. There is zero restriction in the platform, and we've learned lots of lessons going through a number of other ISDA protocols and otherwise, and those needed to be restricted, right? In a certain instance, it's not a bilateral negotiation. This is a bilateral negotiation. You can agree whatever you and your counterparty wish. So that's the flexibility piece. The standardization piece, which is really important actually, particularly for the structured data point, is that we are trying to standardize not what people agree, because we have flexibility, but how they agree and the process by which they agree. And one of the reasons that I know that is powerful, because that is exactly what industry associations are built on, right? They standardize a process. The ISDA master agreement is a process, right? The front part or the pre-printed portion of it is that everyone knows that's where I start, and I negotiate off of that. So what we've done is we've extended that, right? We've said, okay, we have a pre-printed portion, we have a portion of the document, and this is in the newly published is the documents. We have a portion of the document where you make choices, and all of those choices are basically yes, no, not applicable, applicable, and so on. And then there's a separate section where, if necessary, you can rewrite the entire contract, right, and agree to any bespoke terms you need, so that we have set up flexibility, because you can have any term you want, but we've standardized the process and made it very, very simple, I think. And the purpose of that is really to be able to pull and extract as much structured data as possible. And where we don't have structured data, because someone has gone off script and gone free text, we know exactly where it is, right? So we can easily identify it. Now, the really, I'm glad we started with data on this, because the really cool part is not, look, this is all the platforms, I think, right, are a creation, negotiation, execution platforms, but that's not where all the power is. The power is on the data, I think, and what we can do with it downstream. And that is really, really been kind of a cool part of this for me in particular, because we've been talking about providing APIs to counterparties where they can just pull the data automatically. But more importantly, APIs where they can push data to the platform and automate their negotiations, right? So I'll give you an example. I go out and say, I'm going to go back to the easy one, base currency is dollars. And I'm willing to accept dollars, euros, and pounds, but I go out with dollars. My counterparty comes back with pounds. I can actually have my internal platform accept pounds on an automated basis without having any human intervention. So long as, now this sounds great, and people might say, oh yes, I'm definitely going to do that. You have to have the internal systems that can do that, right? It relies on that because we allow you to push, we don't do it for you. But people are already telling us, yes, we'll be using that immediately.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think we've been building integration into both margin exchange and ISDA create, and having very robust APIs and the ability to interact with it has enabled us to show an end-to-end flow in terms of an executed document being turned into an operational agreement, such that it's, as soon as it's executed, we can show that a margin calculation can take place based on the underlying data that comes from that. I think one of the things with that is looking at is the importance of having a standard way of representing those agreements and bringing together the worlds of an operational usage of that data with the data that you may capture in order to be able to generate the PDF representation. I think one of the observations I've had from doing that in the integration, that there's still a little bit of a, there's a gap between what is recorded traditionally in a document and what may be required to be operationally useful down the line. And in a way, that's as much a problem when we look at the digitization side as well. And we can look at how we can capture that data, but there's still, in my mind, there's still going to be a gap between operationally what is needed and what data is defined up front. But maybe we can talk a little bit about digitization and sort of look at the role that has in this world as well. So I have two mics. So well, two mics, and you each have two mics yourself. But Mike Barrett, maybe you'd go first from a Genpact perspective and sort of give your view on what you're doing from a Genpact point of view and how that fits into this whole ecosystem.
Okay, happy to. First of all, I want to just say kudos to Alan Overy and to Linkletters, because what they're building ultimately means you don't need a lawyer to negotiate these agreements. So, investing in these platforms is important to do. So congratulations, guys. I think that's great. When we started out with our collateral agreement reference data system, we began from two sources. One is we had a huge remediation project that we were doing for a large investment bank where at least 30 to 35% of their documentation did not match up with their collateral management system, with the attributes, with the data. The data did not match. And that's because agreements were getting amended. There were new agreements coming in, and it was fat-fingered into the system. And so you didn't have the accuracy that was there either. And we also came from the position that we wanted to build some algos for collateral optimization. And in order to get to the point where you can really optimize collateral, there's two critical pillars. One are the rules, and that's what are contained in the agreements. Everything that we do in margin and collateral management is rule-based. So you have to be able to understand the rules, see the rules, and be able to understand how those rules are applied across collateralized trading agreements, whether they be CSAs or they be GMRAs or they be securities lending agreements. Anything that is affecting a counterparty is, from a counterparty risk perspective, important to understand. It's also important from the operational point of view. And so we built this tool to take basically your PDFs and extract all that information and then build the database that can be not only used by collateral managers, but also can upload the collateral management system. And we had our alliance partner, when we began this, was Lombard Risk. So those of you who are familiar with Colleen, it's an enterprise system. It goes across repo, it goes across lending, goes across TBAs, goes across your OTCs and your cleared. So it covers the entire scope. And so this matched up well with what we could provide in terms of extracting those key attributes and turning them into actionable data. And that's basically what we do today, and it's an enabler along with your inventory system, which is your collateral management platform or system, knowing where what's accessible to you, where your collateral is, along with the rules that tell you what you need to do by counterparty, organized by counterparty, and across counterparties, enables you to optimize the collateral. Without those two, you just can't get there. So what we call our platform cards, we also basically refer to it as your collateral rule book, because you can't play the game without the rules.
Michael Hines, can we get your perspective in terms of the role that digitization has and where you kind of seeing that used? Is it a case of you use digitization negotiation or a combination? What is that sweet spot, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So I have an apology, first of all, which is that as a technologist, I really should have been investing in smart contracts rather than trying to decode dumb ones. And that is a good point, and a lot of people raise that to me quite vociferously. And I think I just want to explain why I think digitization is still going to be very important. And it comes back to the point that the other Mike mentioned, which is today, contracts, there is a single platform that everybody uses for negotiating these contracts, right? And that's Word and email. That is the platform that the market's on. So my group in PwC is supporting a number of big banks through Brexit at the moment, and it's all done on Word and email. How far away are we from phase 5 of IM? We're not 3 years away, we're not 10 years away. We're going to kick that off, probably in the summer. So there are going to be a lot of dumb contracts around. There's no doubt about that. And I think that the efforts that both A&O and Market are making, Linklaters and ISDA are making are exactly the right investments the industry needs to make. We need to move to smarter contracts. And I'm sure that there will be significant take-up in the market around those platforms. So that's all good. But there's going to be, I think the problem with current technologies, and I don't know these two technologies intimately, but I think the problem with smart contract technology today is they are great for drafting standard contracts, and they're great for dealing with a limited playbook and elections and fallbacks. The problem is that there are 2,000 derivative lawyers out there who are artists in their profession, and it is going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the box for 9 months, 10 months as we go through it. Now, some, I think, because there is a big willingness, there's a huge emphasis, I think, particularly in the big sell-side organizations, to achieve standardization, to move away from bespoke and weird terms, to have, and the key thing is to have certainty on the data. But I think we're still going to be in a world where there will be a need to look at dumb contracts. And I think so. The way that we've looked at that is I spent too long in my life looking at digitization. And I think that I spent the first 5 years in a world of rules. So we talked about rules in a number of different contexts here today. But actually, organizations that want to transition data from unstructured documents to structured XML or whatever, and back again, the way they do that is with rules, right? And if you look at any of the IM docs or a regs VM CSA, you need a ton of rules. And that was the thing that I didn't feel from a technology point of view I was comfortable about tackling. So we've tried to build technology without rules. So it's more of a kind of a matching engine. And what that's trying to say is actually that even though these 2,000 lawyers have given it their all, there is still a lot of consistency. There's still a lot of standardization. And what you need to do is you need to capture that with certainty, and then you need to be able to actually look at the bespoke stuff pretty closely. So that's all we've done. But I think, I think my big plug actually is for the role that Acadiosoft are playing in this, because I think there's going to be a lot of different endpoints to negotiations. But what everybody needs is certainty about the data, and to have, if you've got a certainty that crosses counterparts, that's even better. So I think as an aggregator of different data and to be able to provide a single source and transformation to big organizations on all their data, however that's been negotiated, I think that is the critical piece. And I think, however you get there, just make sure it ends up in AcadiaSoft would be my message.
I would agree with that.
Richard,
Yeah,
man,
Mike.
just one comment, and I want to build on what Mike just said. The importance of Agreement Manager at AcadiaSoft is why we're here. Not only is it a golden source of data for the industry overall, but the data model that we spend a lot of time on is going to bring standardization to the industry in terms of we all agree that we call this, we call this, that, and we agree on what those terms are and what those attributes are. That is something that brings us all together because it doesn't stop here. In 2021, we have LIBOR going away. I mean, that's going to have a huge impact on not only the collateralized trading agreements that we're involved with, interest rate swaps and so forth, but also on loan agreements and syndicated loans and so on and so forth. And the more that we can come together as an industry and have that overarching view and agree on what we call things, which is what drives this in Agreement Manager, the better off we'll all be.
I agree. I mean, a lot of what we've done, the approach that we've taken with Agreement Manager is start with the idea of creating a standard, and more importantly, making that view of the standard available to everybody, right? It's nothing's proprietary here. There's no benefit of us having the best agreement model and no one else having that ability, right? So, what we did is we put together a model, we made it available to as many people as we could, and then we started to try to build partnerships around that and build an infrastructure around it. So it's not just a data model, but it's also an API that allows you to look at the workflow of the life cycle of that agreement, right? So allowing you to represent the data, but also capturing what's being created, the agreement, the amendment, and the discontinuation of those. And having as many people as possible review that and provide feedback on it, and try and bring that together. So once you kind of have that standardization, you have that partnership, so you have sources of data that you can bring in. You then look to consolidate it, right? You try to bring that in to think about, okay, there's a lot of great innovation going on. There's a lot of existing agreements that haven't even been digitized yet. So how can we bring together solutions that are not just looking forward, but trying to actually solve a problem that you may need to tackle first before you even get to thinking about, I want to think about negotiation. I don't even have a digital representation of my existing agreements. So how can we bring together partners where I don't want to have to build all of this myself, because these guys have spent, as Mike said, more time than he cares to have done putting these solutions together. There's no point me reinventing the wheel, but what we can do is create an infrastructure that brings all these things together, and linking that in with the negotiation system, so that we have a way of digitizing existing agreements and capturing all of the new agreements that come forward. But also, Nitka, you brought up earlier about interoperability and sort of dealing with that integration challenge as well. So I think it's very important when you consolidate that data that you perhaps look at it from the point of view of how can I automate the process of going. There were the conversations earlier about how long it takes, how long you need to have something in place before you can be ready to execute, right? I think we really should be looking at why. Why does that take so long, and what can we do to chip away at that? Because as Chris said right at the beginning, right, how can we move to more of a just-in-time process of getting these agreements in place? It should be possible. We just have to keep looking at what are the things that are preventing us from doing that. And I think standardization, consolidation, and then looking at automation and understanding the challenges and what can remove those blockages. How do we go forward with that? I mean, do you guys have any kind of view on where we're going and what this could mean?
So I guess current process is that negotiation takes place on Word and email, right? Which is just shocking. Next, you'll be telling me that we're still using faxes too. Just don't even get me started on that. But finally, the document gets negotiated. It is read by an operations person who probably is not a lawyer, interpreted and manually entered into their internal systems. If you're on AcadiaSoft, either for your initial margin process or for your legacy messaging, then there's some data entry required in there too. And then you hope that the data that you've captured is the same as your counterparty and that it's accurate. And when you layer that many manual processes on top of each other, you inevitably find out that it isn't. Okay? So we need a new model. So we talked about two potential models, the document from the data and the data from the document. As I mentioned before, I think the right answer is a mix of both. You will always need to have a model where you have a document and you can extract data from it for the reasons mentioned, because the negotiation platforms don't cover every type of document that exists at the moment. And you won't always have a counterparty who's willing to use them. And you know, as both Mikes pointed out, the lawyers are probably not going to go down without a fight, right? So you do have to have that, even if I think we'd acknowledge that the OCR functionality has gotten much, much better, and the AI behind it has gotten much, much better. We could probably get into the high 99.x% accuracy, even if it's not 100. When you take the other model, which is starting with the data on the negotiation platform and creating the document, you are 100% sure that the data in your document is captured accurately because the document was literally created from the data, right? Which is really powerful. Then you can take that and feed it potentially into AcadiaSoft's Agreement Manager. You can match that with your counterparty. You can feed it further down into your own internal systems. You know that all of the data points are standardized and everyone agrees that X means X and Y means Y. And then you know that the data in the document, the data in AcadiaSoft, the data in your internal systems, and the data that your counterparty have are all accurate and they are all the same as each other. Good Lord.
Right.
That's a better model.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's our whole goal, right? Is like how do we remove the sources of disputes, right? And let's start with agreements. You know, remove that away. Have this digital record, because once we have that, there's so many services you can layer off of this, right? That's what makes it really exciting. It's a foundation. You get that right, it's a foundation for a lot more things that go through. Okay.